Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So we're running a few minutes behind schedule, so we're gonna try and catch up. Thank you again to panel one for really interesting discussion. I'm sure we could talk about that topic all day. A lot to say. We're going to continue now with our second panel on making affordable insulin access a global priority. This has been something, a lot of us, our community's been advocating for a long time. And we're going to continue the conversation. I'm going to hand it over to Jing Luo. He's my colleague within IATA. He co-leads the Access to Medicines and Diagnostics pillar. He's also an associate professor of medicine at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's a principal investigator of the Human One trial, the trial looking at long-acting human versus analog insulin in children and youth with type 1 diabetes in Bangladesh and in Tanzania. So Jing, floor is yours.
Hey, everybody. I have the honor of moderating this panel. And I think actually any of you in the audience could probably be a really good panelist given all of your incredible experience in this space. And when I think about this topic, I'm just torn by so much tension, tension in what is happening in the world and in thinking about insulin and diabetes supplies. And part of that tension we heard earlier between what was presented by some of the previous panelists and the question that was asked in the audience. And part of the tensions, I feel in my own clinical practice. For example, I go to the ADA conferences, the American Diabetes Association, and when you go to a session, it'll be a packed conference room, and some endocrinologists will be standing at the podium, and they'll be telling you this great story about how one of their patients, who's an 80-year-old patient living in a very high-resource city, Santa Barbara, California, improved their time in range from 85 to 90%. And then everybody cheers in the audience, and then we come here, and then Seita shows us the videos and the pictures of what's happening in Gaza in the tent cities, and I'm thinking, oh my God, how can we, as a civilization, as a people, as a humanity, allow these simultaneous things to happen just in different parts of the world? And so there's this natural tension there. And so the other part of the tension is thinking about all the progress that we've made to date in trying to manage and improve the lives of people living with type 1 diabetes globally. Much progress has been made, even in the past 5 years, and I can highlight some of those. There's not so much time to talk in depth about those, but I'm just, I jotted down a couple of things that I thought were really notable. First is the World Health Assembly resolution in terms of the global diabetes targets. Second, I think a lot of data and publications and recommendations have come out with respects to thermostability, because that was one of those key topics that we first introduced in 2019 at the first Symposium. There's been a lot of work done with respects to the EML, as well as pre-qualification. So these are all at the international level, really important things, but there are still tons of remaining challenges and things where I think we can try to push the envelope a little bit. And so, when Helen and I were first thinking about this session, we were wondering this question, and there are people who pondered this question, which is human insulin in a vial, should that be the only available option for people living with diabetes in humanitarian settings? Some would say, sure, it's very high quality product. It will save your life and it'll prevent you from going into DKA, but is that standard, which should be universal and minimal, is that good enough? Or should we push for something more? And so I think that will be one of the things that we try to discuss during this panel. And of course, we'll talk about models of care and new research and new models of care that can be done perhaps in some humanitarian context. So it's very exciting and interesting. And just a couple of quick plugs. One is that we have a diagnostics workshop tomorrow. And so if you're interested in supplies and diagnostics and CGMs, you can come to our workshop there. And then also, Helen and others will have organized a draft for a sign-on letter to the insulin manufacturers with respects to this particular topic and about availability for pens beyond just human insulin in a vial. And so we'll try to share that with the attendees, maybe by email after today's session, and give you some time to review it and decide if it would be appropriate for your organization to sign on for that particular private letter to the manufacturers. And with that, I'm gonna maybe move on to the next slide and ask Helen to come up. Sure, you can do it from there.
So I'm going to introduce this with a big caveat that this is an analysis in motion, let me say. But one of the key things in the Boston Declaration was to hold us as agencies accountable for what we're doing, what we're providing in terms of diabetes care. And we know, we've talked about the basics, we've seen the challenges in this first session. And so I really wanted to push MSF. Thank you, IADA, for making us do this and bring this. I say it's a work in motion, but just to show something and to show where we're at and to be honest with those challenges. So yes, more work to be done and definitely to dive into this data further. So I just wanted to share this. It's a bit of a busy slide, but this is this is 2022 data. There's a reason for that, just because time lag of data and time lag analysing our supply data. So this is 2022. In 2022, MSF carried out 205,000 consultations for diabetes. I'm going to say I'm ashamed to say I cannot tell you how many people we treated for diabetes. We need to invest much, much more in our data systems. We have some projects that can do that, the vertical projects, but across the board, we still cannot tell you how many people. So this is an investment we need to make. As you can see, the vast majority of people we're treating with diabetes are in the Middle East and Asia, so Syria, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Lebanon, and Iraq are accounting for the vast proportion of the diabetes work we are still doing. Lots of dots all over Africa, but the actual volume of diabetes care we're doing in Africa is still very small. I do want to have a positive note, is that since 2019, we are seeing, we're a very complicated organisation with 5 different sections, but you'll see for each of those lines, there's a general trend upwards in terms of the amount of diabetes care that we are providing. So I'm seeing that as a positive trend, and we need to make sure that continues in the upwards direction. Oh, that's very strange. I'm not quite sure what happened there. Let me see. No. Anyway, what I'm going to say is what we did is we looked at all the projects that MSF is implementing around the world. And then with the technical advisors, we looked at the projects and said, should this project be providing diabetes care? So look, if it's a measles vaccination campaign, I'm not expecting them to think about diabetes, yeah? So is this a project? Is it a primary healthcare project? Is there an OPD being supported? We were pretty, I think I'm going to say we were quite ambitious in our ask. Is it an antenatal care that should be screening for gestational diabetes and treating that? Is it a TB or an HIV project that should, according to WHO guidance, be integrating the screening and treatment of diabetes? Yeah, so we were, I'd say, pretty ambitious in the inclusion of the projects where we said diabetes care should be happening. And if my memory serves me right, out of around, Philippa, do you want to say it? Thank you. I don't know what happened there. Yeah, so out of 315 projects, that's kind of being implemented, I'd say, in around 25 countries. 54% of those projects that we thought should have been providing diabetes care were providing diabetes care. So we're very upfront. There is still a lot more to be done. Yeah. The second thing we did is then go to our supply data, and this is where we really need to kind of dig into it more. And say, certainly I can think of other questions I want to ask from supply, but we looked at the countries that had provided more than 1,000 diabetes consultations. So the countries which were, let me say, the bulk of our diabetes operations. And we looked at how many vials were being sent to those countries and translated that into the number of days of insulin treatment being provided, and then the number of pens that were sent to those countries. So you can see in MSF operations, we are still predominantly providing diabetes care with human insulin in a vial. We have a handful of settings: Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, where pens have been provided. I would say Lebanon, as you can see from the figures, really being the one where we've invested in that change experience. But still, very little insulin being provided in pen devices, and that has been due to cost, primarily, I will say. And this is something in MSF we've been discussing about, is in terms of the quality of care, quality of life for people living with diabetes, how can we start to think about maybe, and this will be the conversation for the panel, moving towards devices and maybe types of insulin that might be more patient-centered, and improve the quality of life for people living with diabetes. So that was just a little snapshot, and I apologise for its roughness, but we're certainly going to take that back and take that back to the operations to see where we go with that.
Can I get that clicker back? So thanks for that. Thanks for that, Helen. One of the things that Helen has been asking me on some of our bi-weekly, monthly calls is if I could come up with a photo of what, somewhere around a 1-month supply for someone using insulin, human insulin in a vial would look like. And here's what I went to my diabetes educator's office and I said, hey, do you have some diabetes supplies? And we just started pulling things out of our closet. So please ignore all the brands for the various devices and lancets and things. These may not be available in your local context because they're from a clinic in Pittsburgh. But essentially in that box are 100 insulin syringes with the insulin needles pre-attached. So they're quite nice. You don't have to mess around with drawing needles and things like that. And then there's a vial of, that's just saline. The human insulin in a vial, I think it's maybe a little bit smaller than that particular one. And then I think there are about 50 lancets in that box, and there's a glucometer and a little device that you can use to kind of make the lanceting a little bit easier, I guess. But essentially, this amount of insulin supplies, I think, is the bare minimum of what you would have to carry around with you if you were a person living with type 1 diabetes and you were, actually, it doesn't really matter what context you live in, a stable, low-resource setting or in a humanitarian context where you're escaping earthquake or man-made conflict. And so, yeah, just imagine lugging that around with you in addition to thinking about housing and food insecurity and tents and bombs and things like that. Okay, so that is the reality, I think, for millions of people living with type 1 diabetes around the world. If you happen to be able to have access to analog insulins or insulins that are available in pens or other formulations, great, good for you. But if not, this is essentially what is currently being procured in many, many contexts. And so with that in mind, I'm going to move on. And I don't know, should I show the video? Okay, all right. Because next up, I'm going to show a video from one of the MSF projects in Lebanon, where they have started to introduce insulin in pens, and there'll be some clinicians and patients also speaking about their experience there.
أول شي كنت بخاف من الإبرة من غزتها بخاف آخذها لأنه بتوجع.
الإبرة كتير صعبة علي، كان إنه ما أبقى لا أطلع برات البيت ولا أبقى أطلع مع رفقاتي ولا هيك بالمرة. ساعتها كان معي مرض نفسي منه للسكر.
هلا عمري 40 بيقولوا يعني بيسألوني قديش عمرك، بقول لهم 40 بيقولوا لي 50. يعني تأهرمت عليها.
تأهرمنا نفكر شو للمستقبل لإلها كيف.
Living with constant anxiety, Siwa's father shares the experience of many parents whose children are living with type 1 diabetes and who must therefore inject insulin every day simply to stay alive. It's a complicated disease that demands a complicated treatment, as Musa's mother also acknowledges.
من دخلنا على المشفى وطبعا أطباء بلا حدود أخذنا ساعدوني كثير حتى علموني كيف أتعامل معه، كيف أعطيه الأوبر، كيف إنه لازم يعيش، كيف لازم ياكل، كيف لازم يمشي. حاليا يعني إنه تعودنا شوي بس لساتنا لحد الآن يعني صار له 5 سنين أو أكثر كمان لساته يعني بنعاني إنه في صعوبة لسه بالمعاملة معه.
The challenges of Zainab, Ali, Siwa and Musa are shared with many others living with type 1 diabetes in Arsal, the town in northern Lebanon where MSF runs a project to treat people with type 1 diabetes. Dr. Beverly Prater, a physician from Canada, has been working in the MSF project to support patients.
Insulin pens are one of several ways that we can give insulin to a patient. The more traditional, slightly more old-fashioned version is the classic little glass vial of insulin with the syringe and a needle. The beauty of the insulin pen is that it makes it super easy to do what they were already doing before with the vials, but it also has an added safety component because it's much harder to measure the wrong amount or be confused about how many units you gave yourself or to forget where was the measurement, etc.
Dr. Sosan Yakub, a paediatrician working in the project, agrees that the insulin pens give parents or other carers without expert training much more confidence about the injections. She also sees other benefits to patients.
هلا اكيد نحن لاحظنا انه في كثير تحسن عند الاولاد لما استخدموا الاقلام مقارنه مع اللي كانوا يستخدموا الفيروس قديما، كثير بتوجع. يعني خصوصي بتعرف الاطفال بيكون الثاني عن الالم هو شيء كثير ستريسفول بالنسبه لهم، فاي شيء ما بيوجع بتلاقي الادهيرنس او انه المرضى عم ياخذوا الدواء بشكل افضل لانه مش عم يتوجعوا عم يتقبلوا. يعني
ما بتشوفيها للابره، وحتى انا يعني عند بدي اعطيها اياها للبنت يعني بحاول انه يعني ايدي تحس بايدي ما تحس بالابره. يعني هي الله يجزيهم خير يعني شغله كبيره يعني بتريح الاطفال كثير.
The pens offer other advantages to older children and young adults. Using pens, teenagers can inject themselves discreetly without fuss. This draws less attention and reduces the worry about how their illness makes them somehow different.
بعد ما أخذت الأقلام وهيك إنه صرت أطلع عادي، يعني صرت حياتي عادي. كون إنه بعدني الشيء ماني متعود عليه، إنه إيه إجباري بدي أطلع عادي، ما هو مرض ولا شيء، إنه هو بحياتي عادي يعني.
Zainab, Ali, Siwa and Musa and their families have clearly benefited as a result of transitioning to insulin pens. More widely, the pens play a critical role in helping people living in complex humanitarian settings cope better with this challenging disease by simplifying treatment.
Life with diabetes is a challenge at baseline for any of us, no matter how privileged or unprivileged we are. But for people who lack a sense of solidified space or dependability of housing, food security, refrigeration, access to electricity, these kind of things facilitates an ease in their daily lives, the logistics of being able to stay alive.
Life for the people of Arsal is never simple, but MSF staff, patients and their families all agree that the insulin pens have given these young people and children at least a small sense of normality.
إنه فرق كتير، جسمي شعال عم بشتغل، يعني عم بحسن اشتغل وقت اللي أخذته، إنه السكر ما بخوف، شيء عادي.
Alrighty. Yeah. This is why I love the comms team at the Access campaign. I mean, that was kudos to them. That's really special. Okay, to kind of introduce this topic in a little bit more detail and to talk about how far we've come, I do want to introduce Claudia Martinez, who is the head of research at the Access to Medicine Foundation. And she's going to be talking to us about what are the insulin manufacturers, the pharma companies currently doing? Historically, what have they been doing to expand access to insulin, and how can these efforts be scaled up?
Thank you so much, Ying, and everyone, especially Helen, for inviting me to share some insights from our work today. So I'm going to start with just a brief overview of who we are. We are a non-for-profit organization. We're based in the Netherlands. And our role is to mobilize healthcare companies, including the big pharma companies, on access to medicine. We work specifically on low and middle income countries, and we are, as I said, independent, which puts us, I would say, in a very strong position to independently assess how far companies are actually going with some of the efforts that they're making. We work across different sectors and programs, and I want to stop here for a second because I think many of you may know us from our large R&D-based program, the Access to Medicine Index, which has been up and running for over 15 years. And within that program, we do track the efforts of the 3 largest insulin manufacturing companies, Lilly, Sanofi, and Novo, and we have 15 years worth of data in trying to understand what they've been doing and whether this is enough. But we also work across different programs, generic and biosimilar medicine manufacturers, diagnostics, vaccines, and medical gases. But also we have some cross-sectoral research. And in 2021, with the support of the Hemsley Charitable Trust, we decided to actually take our R&D-based program and do a bit of a deeper dive into diabetes care by setting up a dedicated program looking a bit more at some of the more specific challenges that people living with diabetes in low and middle income countries are facing, but also to fully understand sort of what are the next critical steps for companies to be able to make a difference. I'm going to be rehashing some of the things that we've discussed today. This is no news to anyone, right? We know that the number of people living with diabetes worldwide is rising, but that people living in low and middle income countries are and will continue to be disproportionately affected. Huge numbers, an unacceptably high number of people in low and middle income countries are not getting the access to the life-saving insulins that they need. And I mean, this is simply in many cases because these insulins are either unavailable or plain unaffordable. We see a lot of momentum for change, and I think we've discussed it already. We have the WHO Diabetes Compact with specific asks towards companies in access to insulin. We have the global targets that Ying just mentioned, the listing of the analogs on the EML. So it is a good moment to further incentivize companies to do more. And at the end of the day, and we've talked about it also, the market is hugely concentrated. We have 3 large insulin manufacturing companies that dominate the supply of insulin worldwide, but particularly in low and middle income countries. These companies do not only can play a role, but they have a responsibility to act more intently when it comes to fixing some of the inequities that we see in insulin access. So I'm going to be sharing now a couple of insights from a report that we launched in 2022. This was a deeper dive into what 4 companies were doing in access to medicine. So we profile Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, Sanofi, and Biocon, which is an Indian-based biosimilar manufacturing company. We came up with 4 key recommendations that I will come back to at the end of the presentation on how these companies can make meaningful change. And we also outline catalyzers, and I think this is something that at the end of the day, we also said, this is not something that can be solved by any one stakeholder. There are some specific aspects and contexts that need to be in place. But again, this is not to say that companies do not have a role to play. So in terms of what we've seen, so first off, I mean, as you would know, the first step for any product to be made available in any country is for companies to actually register the product with the national regulatory authority. And this is where we see huge gaps. And here I'm looking only at the portfolio of insulins of these 4 companies. And what we found back in 2022 is that actually in many low and middle income countries, companies are not bringing their products, right? We looked at 108 countries. In 29 of those, none of the, only 29 have all of the insulins that WHO deems as essential registered. We see that in some countries, particularly the Pacific Island countries and some sub-Saharan African countries, these companies are not really registering any insulin. And I think we've talked also about the discrepancy with analogs. And when we look at the low-income countries, so these are the poorest of the poorest, 15 out of the 27 countries they do not have a single analog insulin registered. So this is already sort of something that we are pushing companies on, something that we are discussing with companies. Also, how is it that they can work to really bring those products to countries in the first place? But beyond that, we've spent quite a bit of time thinking about sort of what is it that companies have been doing, right? And I think I want to start by acknowledging that for the past decades, companies have indeed been making efforts to bring products, to address affordability, to think about low and middle income countries. But the problem that we have is that many of these efforts are actually falling short, right? So companies do have programs, that's true, but these programs tend to be very localized in some countries for some products, which is typically human insulin, and also for some specific populations. So we do have strong programs that we see particularly for children and adolescents, but we do know that many programs are not really reaching everyone who needs insulin. This is a finding from the report that I would say we're cautiously optimistic about, right? So in the last 2 years, we have seen some of the companies actually moving into something that looks like more of a long-term approach. So after years of companies operating, I would say in a relatively siloed way, relying mostly on donation programs, we see 2 companies implementing in 2021 what we would see more as integrated business models. What this means is that the companies are also thinking now about sort of all of these programs that I have been working on for the past decades. How do I best integrate them? How do I scale them up? Novo Nordisk has implemented eye care. They do have an aim to increase the number of people with diabetes that are accessing insulin in 2025 in 49 sub-Saharan African countries, excluding South Africa. The commitment is for human insulin, though. It includes different components, and it's being launched in 7 pilot countries with the aim of actually launching in Asia as well, in Indonesia quite soon. The Global Health Unit of Sanofi also came out in 2021. It targets 40 low and middle income countries. It is a portfolio approach, so 30 medicines, and among those they have analog insulins. And within that, there are some specific commitments to reaching patients with analog insulins, right? And you can see the insulins that are included within their approach, which is mostly an impact brand approach. So the company will be making these insulins available at non-for-profit prices to some of the countries. And they have only done it so far in Tanzania, and they're going to start expanding. And when I said that we're cautiously optimistic about this is early days. We're not able to fully gauge the impact of these programs. We are setting out and we're looking very carefully at how these programs are being implemented, and also discussing with companies what is the true measurement of impact that they're going to be bringing. How can they actually evidence that these programs are reaching patients with products? But what about affordability? This is a huge problem, and I think we talked about it. It's not only for human insulins, for analogs, it's also for human insulins. It is a huge problem for the many people that have to pay out of pocket. And I think in principle, what we have seen is perhaps 3 approaches from companies. The first one is, we know that companies have been implementing price ceilings, and 2 companies, Novo and Biocon, they do have some type of price ceilings where they cap the cost of, in this case, human insulin at a price. And they make this available mostly to the public sector or to governments. There are some problems with this approach in the sense that it is a blanket approach, right? And we do know that the context really matters. What people can actually pay really matters. And also we've had a lot of discussions in terms of, can procurers actually access these access prices, right? And that's the next step. It's not only about setting out a price, but I think companies also have a responsibility to follow through with the implementation. Sanofi, we have seen as the only company that is implementing equitable pricing strategies. I'll explain a bit more what this means, right? Again, I need to preface this with the fact that it is pockets of examples that we see. There are some examples in Nigeria and Kenya where, for example, for Lantus, what they have done is that they have worked with the government to be able to list Lantus within the reimbursement packages. And they have also, in Kenya specifically, they have offered to supply the insulin on par with the price of human insulin. In Brazil, they have a patient assistance program, for example. Again, just a couple of examples of what Sanofi is doing. And again, this is something that needs to be expanded out. We see that is, again, a piecemeal patchwork approach as of now. And as you know, there are many, many initiatives by companies that are mostly through donations. This is both in humanitarian settings, where in humanitarian settings, we tend to see that it's mostly human insulin in a vial. There are some examples of companies engaging in short-term donations like Eli Lilly and Sanofi, where they have included analogs, but those are not necessarily the norm. And we do see that companies do have long-standing donation programs, specifically as part of their pediatric programs, right? CDIC, Life for a Child. In the case of Novo, again, human insulin. In the case of Lilly, they have donated cartridges of insulin, including the analogs, since 2009. And finally, I want to stop here because we've talked a bit about supply chains, right? And this report is a very long report. We identify different ways in which companies were trying to support better supply chain management and work locally. Here, I'm just outlining 3 examples that we found to be interesting, in that recently we have seen some companies engaging in more local manufacturing efforts. 2 companies at least are supporting partnerships with local partners in South Africa, in the case of Novo, and Eli Lilly in Egypt through Eva Pharma. They are different partnerships. In the case of Novo, it is for the production of human insulin. In the case of Lilly, it is a distribution manufacturing partnership where Lilly supplies the API at discounted prices, and they also transfer technology and expertise. And finally, heat-stable insulins. Companies are working on this in some ways. Novo has worked on thermal stability for some of their insulins. They have progressed in registering these insulins in 32 countries already. But again, this sort of shows that there's a lot of potential for companies to expand further. These are just some of the examples that we see. And not to say that it's not commendable, but I would say that there are things where companies need to become more deliberate on when it comes to access. So what is it that they can actually do, right? So I think these are the 4 things that I think are extremely important. Expand registration, right? Not only to human insulins, but also to analogs. Really prioritize low-income countries as well. Look at the countries with the highest burden of disease. Look at the countries with the highest need. Companies have a responsibility. They hold the keys for access. If they don't register, products will not be there. They need to continue to invest and also accelerate access to these novel diabetes treatments and also the delivery methods. We haven't really seen very strong examples of companies really providing some of these insulins in pens, for example, as we've discussed earlier. Addressing affordability and accessibility challenges, and do this sustainably, right? Companies, even though donations are extremely important, and I'm talking outside of humanitarian settings, right? It is important that companies look at sustainable models. It is important that they work with local health partners to ensure that these are being introduced into health systems. And finally, collaborate, really collaborate to optimize supply, distribution, administration. Many of the challenges in the supply chain may sit outside of the company's remit, but there is huge capability for them to collaborate more and to bring their expertise also. So with that, I just want to say that just to recap quickly, and I think this is going to be sort of an interesting panel discussion moving forwards. Many people are not accessing insulin. And even though companies are making steps, I would say, to address some of these challenges, they've begun scaling some of their models. Their efforts are still piecemeal. Just a few products, just a few settings, just a few countries. And I think if companies have sort of the intent and the opportunity, they should take it up to really address access. And there are tangible ways. There are actionable ways in which companies can do this. Thank you so much, and I'll hand over back to you, Ying.
Such a helpful presentation. I'll just note that we did reach out to the insulin manufacturers for this session, and many of them declined to attend. But I think it's probably better to get an objective perspective and an analysis rather than a market-based celebration of their donation programs. That's just my opinion about this. And so my reflection on this really quick, because I'm the moderator and I can say what I like, is that just to remind you, insulin glargine, Lantus, was first introduced in the US in April of 2000. And we are in May of 2024, if I'm oriented. And so we are talking about tiptoeing into introduction of generic glargine, fill and finish, essentially, in Egypt, 24 years after the introduction in a high-income country setting. And so, yes, we should celebrate and applaud and push for more registration, but at the same time, we must not forget that fundamentally, we're talking about, at minimum, a 24-year delay in when poor people can get access to high-quality, contemporary, modern designer insulins that were available in the US and throughout Western Europe. So, lots of progress to be made in existing challenges. And then, a lot of that is about pricing and IP, and so I wanted to reintroduce Helen and have her come up and share some of the really interesting research which was recently published.
Great, thank you, Jing. So what I'm going to present in the next few minutes is a paper, an analysis that was just published in JAMA a few weeks ago on the estimated sustainable cost-based prices for diabetes medicines, a total mouthful, which took me the best part of 2 years to understand what we were doing. But basically what I'm going to try and show you is what could it cost to make insulins. That's what I'm going to try and show you in these slides. I want to say, first of all, a big thank you to Krista, but also a big thank you to Melissa and Diz, who really supported MSF Access Campaign to get this paper published. So coming back, and I just really want to thank James for reminding us in every presentation, why on earth are we doing this? And I think I really don't want to publish papers for the sake of publishing papers. It's pointless. So why did we do this work? And it was driven kind of from our operations in MSF. We wanted to know, first of all, what is the injection device preference of people living with diabetes? We wanted to document kind of the experience that our operations were already doing, experiencing in terms of using injection devices and the additional costs that was incurring to our operations. We want to improve the transparency on insulin and diabetes medicines prices, because that is currently very poor. And also, could we bust the myth that pens and analogues are beyond the reach of LMICs because of cost? There was a previous publication in, I think, 2018 on the cost of production of insulins, but that paper did not include the pen devices. So we wanted to add that, update the costing data, but add the costing for the pen devices specifically. So that was the addition in this paper. So one of the kind of parallel pieces of work and foundation of this work is we also collaborated with T1 International. We did a survey, 403 respondents across 38 countries, in terms of what are there. These were insulin users who had both experience of vials and pens. So they had used both options. And 82% of the people we surveyed said they preferred pens. And the kind of infographic on the left here is really just kind of demonstrating some of those reasons that were flagged in this survey. So the issues around dosing, feeling safer, less worry about wrong dosing and hypoglycemia. Worries about breaking vials, and I say in our context where people are on the move, they say grabbing stuff, just having a glass thing that is going to crash and break was flagged as a worry. Less pain, that volume of stuff that you need to carry around is less using pens, and generally this impact on quality of life, being able to inject yourself outside the home, kids taking their injections at schools. Many children are still excluded, I hear, just this week from school because they're having to inject. So these were some of the responses from that survey. Again, what are we seeing in humanitarian settings? This links to what we heard earlier, is that in many of the crises we're responding to is people are already coming on pens as they are the norm. I mean, there's no way I'm prescribing human insulin in a vial to anybody in UK or Western or European setting. So they're already coming on pen devices. So MSF has supported patients to buy pens, for example, in Ukraine, and I know we have also shipped pens to the recent Gaza crisis. Pens were not used as the standard of care in MSF programs across the board, and I showed that bit of data earlier, and that was primarily because of cost. And as far as we're aware, they're not being used routinely by other humanitarian agencies. And as I think Slim flagged earlier, at the moment, they're not yet in the NCD emergency kits, and that's a point for debate. So what's in this paper? So in the paper, we're showing what are the production costs and estimated cost-based generic prices for diabetes medicine. So what does that mean? It's like the cost of manufacturing a unit, then the manufacturing costs plus a profit margin, and I'll show you a little bit more the detail of that. And then what we did is we then compared those manufacturing costs and profit margins to currently observed market prices. So in the paper, we have all types of insulin, human and analog, but also in vials, what it costs in vials, cartridges, and pre-filled pens, and we present those as costs per month. And then we also then went on and did a calculation of the annual cost of delivering a regimen. And then you'll see in the paper a variety of different regimen options for type 1 and also type 2 diabetes. And Slim kept talking about the bundle, and we have included in that cost the cost of the insulin syringes or the pen needles that you need to screw onto your insulin pen. Yeah, so you need to get that drug into your body. That has a cost. Yeah, so we have included that in the annual regimen costs. In the paper, there's also GLP-1s and SGLT2s for type 2, but not for discussion today. So for the market prices, we collected data from a total of 12 countries, 4 high income, 8 middle income, chosen on availability of data. I'll come back to the point of price transparency, not a given. No low-income country with publicly available pricing data for diabetes medicines, but also these countries provided a degree of kind of geographic and economic diversity. Now, this is in the paper. Don't want to kind of blindside everybody with a very small text algorithm, but just the 3 points I want to flag on the algorithm. At the top, you'll see in the paper for this estimated cost-based price, we have a range, the lowest possible and the highest possible. And that range is based on whether we're looking at a competitive formula or a conservative formula. And the competitive formula is assuming an economy of scale. If a company is making more of something generally, or the demand of that product is more generally, the price will come down. The conservative formula assumes smaller production of volumes. Oh, I thought these had gone. Never mind. I'm having real slide problems today. Lord. Don't know what's happened. Anyway, I shall point. The other point I wanted to make out is for the costing of the actual insulin pens, we consulted with insulin manufacturers and also manufacturers of the pens. They're not always made in the same house, in the same company. And then the last point I just want to make at the bottom there, goodness me, I don't know what's going on with this. Hang on. Let me just get to the bottom. Yeah, the last point there is that this formula, this algorithm, is including a degree of profit. Yeah. So the competitive formula is adding a 10% profit. The conservative formula is adding a 50% profit. And that is based on what we see across markets in terms of what we see companies generally, adding in terms of their pricing strategies. So this is not just what it costs to make it, it's what it costs to make it, and we can argue the toss around what we think is a reasonable profit for a company to make. And I would refer you to all three companies' last annual reports in terms of the profits they are making globally currently. This might take me a while to get through this slide. I think it keeps going back. You really need to look at this algorithm, yeah. To understand it. Okay, so what did we find? Now, there's lots of numbers in this paper. I've just kind of pulled out a few. Okay, so per unit, what could it cost to make human insulin in a vial, a cartridge, and a pen? And this is what we found. So this is with a 10% profit margin. A vial of human insulin could be $1.59, a 3 ml cartridge 0.6, and a pre-filled pen 3 ml pen pre-filled pen 0.94. This is per unit. For analog, and I'm going to use just for simplicity glargine as the example, a vial $2.83, cartridge 0.96, pre-filled pen $0.13. What's not in the paper is what MSF is currently paying, and I'm happy to share that with you all today. So we pay $2 per human insulin in a vial, so pretty close to that cost of production. I'd say it could go lower. We've just renegotiated our contracts. We now pay 2.48 for a cartridge and $3.7 for a 70/30 as the example, just for this slide, in vial, cartridge, and pen. So you see this huge kind of market variation across countries. I would kind of deign to kind of say there is slightly less market variation in the glargine market, but maybe I'm imagining that. But I think that there's certainly this kind of slightly less diversity in prices in that glargine market. So in terms of comparing these lowest estimated cost-based prices to current market prices, and we look at the percentage kind of markups using India, South Africa, the States is just a crazy situation, but I think it's useful to also demonstrate that crazy situation. You can see the extent of those markups. So comparing the lowest estimated cost-based price of human insulin and analog insulins in pens, over 500% markups in India. South Africa, 100% markup on human insulin and glargine. Don't even talk about the US, what's going on there. Then what we did is we took those lowest estimated cost-based prices, and you'll see in the paper the ranges as well, by just using this as a demonstration from the paper. And we said, okay, what if we could get those prices, what would an annual cost for a basal bolus regimen be for somebody with type 1 diabetes? And if we're doing it in vials, we included the cost of the insulin syringes. If we're doing it in cartridges, we included the cost of the reusable pen and the pen needles. And in the pre-filled pens, the pen needles that you need to screw on. And what we showed here, so this is for a basal bolus regimen, so that's 4 injections a day. What we've demonstrated, and I'm going to keep saying the word could, at those lowest estimated cost-based price, it could be less expensive to use pens, and it could be less expensive to use analog insulin in pens than human or analog insulin in vials. Yeah, and I keep saying could, yes, if we advocate towards the companies to look at the difference between the prices they're charging and these estimated cost-based prices. We did the same for type 2 diabetes, where we see again certainly moving towards reusable pens with cartridges could be less expensive than human insulin in vials. I think there's less of an argument for type 2 diabetes on the analog front, but I think there's a strong argument in terms of use of pens if you see the potential cost differential, bearing in mind many people with type 2 diabetes have sight difficulty, dexterity difficulties, etc. So I think the argument for pen devices versus analogs for type 2 is slightly different. So, dare we think about asking for this? Yeah? $1 a pen. If we had $1 a pen, whether it's human or analog, yeah, could we move towards those annual costs for somebody living with type 1 diabetes? Is that something we think these companies could or should be offering us, or not offering us, we should be demanding of them, yeah, in order for us to provide quality diabetes care? Is that a possibility? And I just wanted to take this petition that maybe some of you saw or signed from T1 International, who actually were ahead of us in our publication and actually have kind of organised this petition amongst people living with diabetes, asking companies to provide a vial of insulin. They don't state human or analog, a vial of insulin at $2 and 5 pens for $5. Yeah, so they're already asking for that. That was a petition that was put out, say, prior to our publication being published. So coming back to kind of maybe some points for discussion, for WHO, Jing mentioned the resolution. In that resolution, there is a clear request to WHO around price transparency. Yeah, and there was this ask of establishing a kind of some web-based tool where this pricing information could be shared. So countries. So if I'm Kenya Ministry of Health, I should know what Uganda Ministry of Health is paying. South Africa, we know what South Africa Ministry of Health pays because it's in their legislation that has to be public. Yeah, but why can't countries know what they're all each paying so that they can have an informed, open conversation with companies? Yeah. Okay. So price transparency, and as far as I'm aware, this is not yet available. Maybe it's in the works from WHO. More to be discussed on that. And then again, for debate, inclusion of diabetes medicines that are on the EML. Do we think these should be included in the NCD emergency kit? And maybe that is also maybe to some extent geography and situation specific. With the manufacturers, we would like to ask that they provide prices for all insulins in all presentations that are transparent, publicly available, and reflect the cost of production. Because as Claudia presented, the only ceiling pricing offers we see are on human insulin in a vial. No company has any pricing, LMIC pricing initiative beyond human in a vial. And then for me, it's up to the government to decide, I'm going to buy human insulin in a vial, that's my decision now. But there is no kind of clear pricing strategy for any other product from any of the companies currently. And then I put this in, and I'm probably going to get into trouble, but I think as well, we can talk all these discussions, and we're going to have a whole session on funding, yeah? Yeah. So, but we know availability of diabetes medicines in low and middle income countries is extremely challenging, and there is no global fund, there's no PEPFAR, and there's not going to be. The first one is a quote from somebody in WHO, I won't name them, talking about another NCD saying we don't talk about funding gap like we do in TB and HIV. There just is there is no funding. So, but we need to do things differently. So, bulk procurement, volume buys bargaining power. How can we how can we move this forward in terms of national and regional bodies working on this? I was in an HIV meeting last week where, PEPFAR and PEPFAR, I think, is getting interested in hypertension, diabetes. They're not going to buy the drugs, but can we use their leverage to sort out some kind of mechanism in terms of pooled procurement? I don't know, just putting that on the table. Health insurance schemes, UHC. Using law, using advocacy in country to make sure diabetes medicines and the right insulins are included in these health insurance schemes. There's so much going on in countries currently on this. Can governments work with private sector around markups and price caps? Just wanted to mention something the MSF did in Kenya. We had a project in Kenya that I was involved in. Fantastic, amazing models of care. We left, disaster. Nobody got their NCD medicines yet. They opened a new diabetes project, and the initiative which was thought about early in the project was what's going to happen when we go. So actually we seed funded a kind of a community-based organisation that has worked with the ministry in that district in Kenya to have a community-based pharmacy which procures medicines at the lowest possible price. So when the drugs aren't there in the ministry pharmacy, and let's be honest, we know they're not always going to be there in a ministry pharmacy. Let's just be honest with ourselves. How can we make sure people's out-of-pocket expenses are as low as possible? I don't have the answer to that, but I just think, how can we work with governments to sort this out? And then, as members of IADA, how do we all feel about advocacy for transparent pricing for human and analog insulins? And I'm going to say, in all presentations, do we feel strongly to advocate and speak out towards these, or requests from these countries to change their current approaches? Yeah? Is that something, as IADA members, we would be interested in doing? I'll stop there. Thank you.
In the interest of time, because I know we have lunch coming up at 12:30, please check out the article. There's some cost-based estimates for GLP-1s as well that we'll talk about a little bit more tomorrow. I'd like to introduce a couple of the panelists to come up, maybe sit up there if that's okay. We have James Elliott, who is a type 1 diabetes activist, and also Irina Vlasenko, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, who's a pharmacist. She is based in Ukraine, and also she's the vice president for IDF, the International Diabetes Federation. And then also online, we have one of the stars from the Lebanon video, Dr. Sassan Yacoub, who is a pediatrician in one of the MSF, the Becca project. And so maybe I'll open it up and allow James to start with some introductory remarks and see if you have any reflections from either your personal experience or maybe from some of the experiences from folks that you work with in the Global Diabetes Compact Forum.
Okay. Hello, everyone. And when I say it's very nice to be here, it's not a trite remark. I actually have known a lot of you for many years, but have never actually been in the same room. So you'll see a very diplomatic introduction to me. So I'm a person living with diabetes, Canadian by accent. I live a lot of the time in Morocco now with my wife. I used to be part of Médecins Sans Frontières. I did a project actually in Becca Valley with Felipa and other people who've left the organization. I'm very excited to hear about the progress happening in Becca Valley. And I never actually went to Arsal. When Arsal was, when I was on the project, Dash had just invaded Arsal, and they said no foreigners. So good to see that. I'm also a founding trustee of T1 International. I've left the board a couple years ago, and I work for a certain international organization that begins with W and ends in O. And I've been told that I cannot officially represent them at this meeting. So I take that to mean I can do what I want. That being said, for information on the WHO Global Diabetes Compact, please see the handouts over there. There's also a card that shows recent technical work on thermostability of insulin. So yeah, and feel free to pass them out. So when Stefan was speaking, I'm going to single you out, Stefan. I realized that it's been 10 years since we met, because we met in a basement at MSF Geneva in 2014. And I remember MSF, Syria had been going for a few years, and MSF had been saying, oh, we're an emergency organization. Should we get into NCDs? I didn't join MSF to do diabetes. I can do that in my home country, blah, blah, blah. And I remember in French, you very passionately said, what are you talking about? I've come from a very small NGO. I live in Mali. I've managed to do all this work. And you're MSF. You style yourselves as this big humanitarian organization, and it's just problems. It's just complication. How horrible. And I think he changed the tenor of the debate quite a bit, and other people too. I mean, Philippa was an advocate back then, myself, people who've left. And then also, Slim was also on the board, Slim Salama, who spoke earlier. And that's actually how I did my first mission, was because Slim, in a basement in Geneva, said, I read your paper on diabetes self-management in Oman. Do you want to do the same in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon? So I did. Now here we are 10 years later, and we're in, not a basement, so we're moving up. And we are in Athens, and there's a room full of people who passionately believe that, no, actually, we can do a little bit better on diabetes. Yeah, actually, it's not impossible. Maybe they don't deserve to die. Maybe we can do something. So here we are 10 years later. There is a WHO Global Diabetes Compact. There are targets for diabetes, including the fact that 100% of people living with type 1 should have access to insulin, should have the ability to measure their blood glucose by 2030. And there's no asterisk on that. There's no, not if it's too difficult, not if the country's too poor, not if there's a conflict. It's 100%. So we have our 90-90-90 HIV moment now. I also want to touch on Mohammed's remarks as well, that I actually found myself in an emergency for the first time. So I lived in Marrakesh most of the year, and I was there for the earthquake. I can say when your house is shaking, you don't think, how am I going to get my diabetes education? You don't think, how am I going to get lentils so I can be low carb? You think, where's my wife? My wife's on the balcony, the house is shaking, let's get the hell out of here. And then when you're outside and everyone's kind of worried about aftershocks, you think, how long is the sensor in my arm going to last? What was my blood sugar the last time I measured it? Is it safe to go back in the house? Is the house stable to go to the fridge? The power is all out. When cell phone reception going to come back? That's the lived experience. And when we have these meetings, and I know, I work, but not I'm representing a technical-based organization, and there is need for high-quality evidence, but there's also need for evidence that is contextually appropriate. So that is done in conflicts, that is done in emergency situations, that is done in cooperation with people living in low-income countries. So I'm very happy to see the work that IATA is doing on the switch surveys. Very excited to see more evidence being generated. It's very much needed. And I also want to say that, I'm not here as a technical expert in this. I've acted as a technical expert before. I've been, also on the medicine patent pool panel. But in this moment, I've been introduced as an advocate, so I'll speak from that. Advocacy does take a toll on you because people who are dying and have died. And, like Vivian and I met John Peter in Dar es Salaam a couple weeks ago, and he's not doing so good. John Peter was one of the voices that launched the WHO Compact, and we used, we utilized his voice on that. And I still think about John Peter, but I also think about, Erin, who died a couple years ago, took her own life. So, not every meeting can be a diabetes meeting. We have a lot of different priorities, but in this room, let's not be fair to the other diseases. Let's actually say that diabetes is very, very under-resourced relative to the global burden. I mean, the official WHO figures are that over 400 million people are living with diabetes. There are more people living with diabetes on the WHO figures than live in the United States. There are more people living with type 1 diabetes than major cities. It's a lot of people. It's not a rare disease. And it's also a disease that has been livable for over 100 years. The inventors or the discoverers of insulin could have been fabulously wealthy and were approached by various American businessmen to open proprietary clinics to be fabulously wealthy, and they chose to have a dream of insulin being available for all in need. So I think we should take some inspiration from that. And I think the requests and the asks of the private sector, I think it is fair to make asks of them. I looked up the market cap of Eli Lilly this morning because I thought, it should still be like 350 billion, but no, it's 750 billion now. Novo Nordisk is single-handedly keeping down inflation for Denmark. It's supplying the welfare state. Sanofi is one of the largest companies in the world and can get a direct line to Macron. It's great. Like a couple $1 million in humanitarian programs and human insulin. That's good. I'm glad and better that they're doing it than they're not. But yeah, we can actually make some demands of private sector, and I think the questions certainly on WHO are fair. So I think I would just want to echo that. Yeah, we can actually be a little bit demanding, and just a shout out to everyone who's starting to incorporate patient voices into research, MSF in particular. And I also want to say that, my wife's grandmother passed away last year, and she had type 1 diabetes. And she had type 1 diabetes and was diagnosed, I think, in the 1930s. So she lived old enough to have grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And that's possible, right? I mean, that was possible using like glass syringes, animal-based insulin, porcine and stuff, no test strips, because test strips hadn't been invented yet. And she made it to live old enough to be a grandmother. And then I was just thinking also in Baalbek, the comment around low carb. One of the best things I ever did while working with MSF was actually doing a focus group with people living with diabetes in Baalbek. And they were people who are not used to Syrians and people living in the Middle East are, especially British people, are not used to how blunt they are. Because I think when you asked how they're doing, they said, horrible. We're doing horribly. What do you expect? We're refugees. Many of my family are dead, and the care that MSF providing is frankly kind of crap. It's not as good as what I could have got back in Syria, for many different reasons. But one of the best things I actually did was to loop people into a focus group is I actually gave them chicken shawarma. So we bought, I think, 100 chicken shawarmas that day. And the people said to me, this is the first meat I've had since the war began. And that had been a couple years. So, yeah, I think we do actually have to put ourselves in these situations, and they're uncomfortable, but we do have to start from a place of grounded reality. But given the care and given the attention, and yes, given the funding, which should be coming from people who can afford to pay for it, people living with type 1 diabetes can become grandmothers. There are billionaire people living with type 1. People with type 1 have led countries before. Sorry if you're a Labour voter in the UK. But let's not have a defeatist attitude. Let's realize that we've made progress in the last 10 years, but we're still a long way to go, but we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Dr. Yacoub, are you able to hear us?
Yes, hello.
How are you doing today? Are you seeing patients in clinic?
No, I'm at the office today.
Please share with us your recent experiences, specifically with the vial to pen conversion program within your project. Tell us about how that has affected the quality of life of your patients.
Yes, first, thank you all for the invitation. And it's actually a pleasure to share our experience in Lebanon in BICA project, switching pediatrics living with DM1 from insulin vials to pens. So I'm Dr. Sausan Yacoub. I'm a pediatrician. I work with MSF in BICA project in Lebanon with NCD pediatric patients and with acute pediatrics as well. So we have actually did a good job with the help of the amazing NCD team, with the endocrinologist actually in switching the pediatrics 1.5 years ago from insulin vials to insulin pens. Actually, we have noticed a great impact on switching on the patients in many ways. First, we have followed up the HbA1c post-switching, post 3 months of switching from vials to pens. And we have shown via the data which we have before and after improvement in around 40% in the patients which were switched. And actually, even in the consultation, when we were having the consultation with the patients, when we were asking them, do you feel more comfortable using the pen than the vials? So almost always the answer was yes. So you will feel much more happy when you see a child 6 years or 5 years of age who is able to know the units of insulin he is using, which is very minimal, and he knows that the prick is not painful. So the scene of only the syringe when it's just without pricking into the body, just to see the children see the pain before they feel it. So we can see even the fear and the anxiety on the caregiver when she was giving the insulin by the vials than the pens. So also we have noticed more adherence to giving insulin. Skipping doses is much more lower than when they were on the vials, because the pain only by itself is a major tragedy and anxiety to the caregiver. What about a mother who is dealing with a DM1 child 2.5 years old? So she has many challenges to deal with rather than just the insulin to give him. So we are just trying to make one part of his life easier, which is just giving the medication in a less painful way, to make the other rest of the challenges which he is having throughout the day. Maybe, we treat them person by person. So we always say that treatment of diabetes is like a multidisciplinary way to deal with. So they don't only need the insulin to be dealt with, they have many other stress events in their life. You have mentioned about the refugees, how much the situation is hard on their life. They maybe don't have access to food, sometimes even to water, which is not very sanitized and have many infections in it. And also due to the economic crisis that Lebanon has been going through the 2 years, also Lebanese patients are having the same circumstances as the Syrians. So we have noticed more and more pediatrics living with DM1 coming to our facilities to seek private consultations, because in the clinics they are unaffordable, and also the insulin is not affordable to buy there. So the question which we are always receiving from the parents of the children, are we always going to have insulin? Are we always going to have it for free? So it is really very, very hard to answer this question. And we know that it's unaffordable for them if the service is not there anymore for both Lebanese and Syrian population. So we always say, let's try to make one part of their life easier by giving them pens in less painful way, easier to use, and also to say that insulin shouldn't be like a luxury for the patient. So we always think that DM1 pediatrics are not like an NCD disease. It's not a chronic disease in our point of view. It's an acute, because in every day, if the patient didn't receive his insulin doses, he can enter into a life-threatening complication.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
Yacoub.
you.
Thank you for joining us. Professor Arina, do you want to introduce yourself and give us your comments?
I'm Irina Vlasenko from Ukraine. I'm Vice President of International Diabetes Federation. You see, I prepare a lot of paper, I occupy it every table, but I say it's not work for me now, but I will try. First of all, thank you very much, Silvia, for invitation. We met personally in Krakow, and I saw how many people really make big input and with heart to this is humanitarian crisis in diabetes. This is very, very important for us. Before our war in Ukraine, I never thinking about it, to be honest. I think about another things, how make this better quality. But when it's when we go to humanitarian crisis, it's absolutely different story. But now I will speak about quality of life and what its difference between vial and pen. I take with me, everybody know this, someone used, yes, and pen and syringe, and I not use vial insulin. I'm afraid that somebody maybe will be a clagger or a complain, but I use my box with perfume. And I am a person who have been living with diabetes more than 30 years. And I have used many different things. For example, syringe, a pen, and a smart pen, and of course I had experience with pump. It's absolutely different story. To be honest, I was very lucky because my parents delivered to me best treatment that they can. And many times we bought insulin and with like pen, in pen. And it's dramatically changed my life. Everybody see this Lebanon people, this film. I absolutely agree with this. It's absolutely changed mind. You became have better life, quality of life. You forgot about your diabetes. Your diabetes not pressure you all the time on your head. It's very important. And when you use, can you help me? Yeah. Can you use how you? No, this, please. Yes. We are not prepared, but it's impression. Так. How we use? When this, I must look. How this do this? Okay. Now I have a good vision. Anyway. And okay, please not look. Not look at me. I must find place which I must. What happens when I have pen? Absolutely doesn't matter. Open, speak, and do insulin. Doesn't matter. But what happens if it's humanitarian crisis? Thank you very much. Don't scare now. I think that everybody's that little bit feeling. I not used picture from Ukraine now. How many damage in my country, but this is you feeling what this, and that we feeling every day. Before bombing day, we listen alert. And of course less electricity, not possibility. How I can do insulin in pen? I can listen. 1, 2, 3, even in dark, and make. But how I can make this in dark? No. How I can make mistake? Of course. This is. Thank you, Gabe, for help me. I think you have really experience in bombing, and and thank you. And this, you see that we must improve our care in a humanitarian setting, and this is used this way, which we can change human insulin in vial to pen. And another case, also my experience when I change insulin from human insulin to analog insulin. It's absolutely dramatically changed life also, because if you use human insulin, you must have regime, time, you know exactly you must eat. If you not eat, will be hypoglycemia. And this is all the time in your head. And this is big pressure. For example, I work in municipal department. I must check our pharmacy, and this is take a long time, like maybe 6 hours. And sometimes it's a new person. You cannot explain that you have diabetes and that you cannot stop and you must eat. This is too complicated. And that what happens, I know that it's also sugar down. I must go to toilet and eat sweets. Unfortunately, it's reality. And this is also, but when I change to analog insulin, I forgot about my diabetes. My mind was free. I'm not thinking about that. I must eat, I must have all the time. Of course, I have sugar all the time. But anyway, this is also best option. And from my side, I agree with Eugene that you say, 24 years late come to analog or pen insulin. Because if we anyway have this treatment, best treatment, why we cannot deliver it to everybody? Yes, maybe it's a little bit more expensive, but this is investment. What we can deserve? We want to deserve a good outcome. And of course, this is deliveries, this is equipment help to have better care. Also, insulin analog make better. Not everybody agree with me. Sometimes we know it's a lot of research about this difference. But anyway, quality of life changed dramatically. And this is patient rights. Why we can deliver to one person the best treatment, to another we must discriminate, because we want to think only about money. But this is investment for future, for less complication, which was very expensive and more expensive for healthcare system. What we, as IDF, thinking that we must prepare also operation on, I can share this information, on our board meeting under the President Akhtar, we decide to make some operation program system, some procedure, how we can manage, but it's practical. We have a lot of documents, and thanks God, we have a lot of documents which developed by WHO, by IADA, which really helped me from beginning of war. And also, we must think in how we can use our research each other, not make same things and maybe add, but together we can achieve more. And if we speak about better care, especially in humanitarian crisis, we must also speak and collaborate with pharmaceutical company. Yes, we understand they must have benefit from manufacture. We know about this. But anyway, they also must think in tomorrow can come another medicine like biosimilar, like generic come, and price will down. But maybe our patient go to this biosimilar, and then they lost market. And this case, I think it's dialogue. It's very important to listen each other and finally come to this main decision, improve care for people with diabetes in humanitarian setting, which they very need, and improve in same times improve quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. Do we have time for one question, or should we go to lunch? How about one? Emma.
This thing on. Hi, thanks to all the panelists. My name is Emma Clateman. I work with Life for a Child. I lead our global policy and advocacy programs. I've also lived with type 1 diabetes for almost 30 years and have been involved in advocacy in one way or another since I was a young person. I think we all, see the imperative in global advocacy, for analogs and pen devices, but what about glucose monitoring tools? It's an essential, part. So it's like using a remote without batteries. So I'm curious what you have to say.
No, I am in complete agreement. And then for background, for people who don't know, I think Emma and Life for a Child have been very instrumental in advocacy to the WHO around the essential diagnostics list. And I want to congratulate you on the success of that and the inclusion of glucometers on that list. But I am in complete agreement. I think the ability to measure blood glucose is like the ability to see in the dark. We can't have a conversation around like global diabetes coverage targets without also talking about access to devices. So complete agreement.
I agree absolutely that we only should advocacy, and explain. And also, what is in my country, in Ukraine, like we have not registered Libra 2 or Libra 1. And what happens? People bring like unlegal black market, for example, and pay a lot of money for this. And but what happens if it will be registered? Of course, price down, and it's about affordable. But company don't want because it's not included in reimbursement system. But we had conversation in past and with the minister, and we had a conversation about we can put here very quickly account, and then we not have million people with diabetes like children, and it's more in big investment, but anyway it's better outcome. And he account, and then okay, we can do this for children reimbursement, but adult can buy with less price, but unfortunately not yet implement, because vice-minister was quit, unfortunately. But anyway, we must work on this. This is a situation in many countries, especially low middle country, which company don't want come to market because it's not reimbursement system. Thank you.
And I think just touching on, what Mohammed was saying at the start is that, access to glucose monitoring is so important during an emergency, because life changes overnight. Your diabetes management changes overnight. You're put on a new insulin. You're under enormous stress. Your diet changes, and your insulin requirements will change. And without diagnostics, your treatment decisions are very much blind. I can't imagine going a day without being able to know what my glucose levels are. I wouldn't know how to use insulin properly. Mm-hmm. I really wouldn't. So I think this is a critical issue.
Yeah, and that's a nice segue into the workshop on diagnostics tomorrow. We'll talk more in depth about these issues. And since we are the International Alliance for Diabetes Action, I'll just close this panel by talking about a couple of actions that we can do. The first is, as I mentioned at the start, Helen and we've drafted a letter to the manufacturers about transparency in insulin pricing, as well as just asking the question, should pens also be made available? Can you please make those available, whether it's human or analog insulins? If that is something you might be interested in reviewing or in possibly having your organization co-sign, please take a look, watch out for that email. We'll be sending it out to all of you, and I'll give you like 1 or 2 weeks and a hard deadline to get back to us, because we do need to submit the letter. And the second piece of action is we are all going to end this session, but before we go to lunch, I think Sylvia would like us all to do a group photo.
Yes, we're going to do a group photo on our way to lunch. So if you can follow Chantal, would you, right over there? She's going to walk us all out to the area where there's some windows and some natural light. And we're going to take a photo. Then we'll all go to lunch. I don't know where it is, but Chantal, you'll show us. And then we'll reconvene here in an hour, so at 1:40, a little behind time. Thank you.
Thanks.